All right, everyone. Well, here is another narrated PowerPoint because something wasn't working quite right with the microphone during our Zoom meeting. So I'm going to give you the narrated version as opposed to the recording of the shared screen from our in-class Zoom meeting. So talking a little more about agriculture today, and particularly in particular biotechnology. But first, we discussed the Machiko's article that was on Moodle, and so we talked about these questions, because it was surprising in a lot of ways, because there's this idea that in fact increased population seemed to be good for the landscape, that the landscape actually looked better, 50 years later from that initial picture in the article. So we talked about this idea of underpopulation, not overpopulation, as a barrier to development. The idea that lands may not have a fixed carrying capacity. Instead, with more people, more labor, you're essentially able to sustain more people. And then once industrial development happens, or at least economic development, then you go through this demographic transition. And so the idea is you have lower birth rates over time, and then no longer have to worry about increasing populations. And finally, we asked the question, is what happened in Machikos the rule, or is it a special case? And just to share a couple thoughts on this, I thought you all had really good questions about this. But just keep in mind that as we consider the environmental impact of a society, population is just one of the factors that comes into play. The others from our IPAT model, of course, are affluence and technology. So as a society becomes more affluent and more technologically advanced, the population may stop growing, but there may still be increasing demand for resources as economic growth and technological advancement happens. So just keep it in mind, right, that it's not all about population size, it's ultimately about resource use, and so that increases as we move forward. And we talked about some reasons that what happened in Machikos might have been a special case. For instance, the nearness to the city of Nairobi, which provided a market, the boom of coffee plantations. But the article also makes the point that Machikos is still not growing all of its own food. So it's actually importing food from outside. So you might look at that and say, let's not draw any hasty conclusions. But anyway, if you haven't read the article, be sure and take a look at it. So we spoke previously about the Green Revolution that increased agricultural production all around the world, more so in some parts of the world than others. And that this was really on the back of a few technologies. There was the increased use of synthetic fertilizers, the increased use of pesticides. There were improved crop varieties, in particular varieties of wheat which had shorter stems, and so they put more energy into grain production. But underlying this whole green revolution also was this reliance on fossil fuels. So to make all of these products, you needed fossil fuels. So the question then is, how sustainable is it? We're able to grow a lot more food, but as we look into the future, as our population starts moving on towards potentially 9 billion, even 10 billion, is the way that we grow our food today impeding our ability to do that in the future? And that, of course, is our definition of sustainable development. But just backing up for a minute, looking across the world, it's very interesting. We in some places we have too little food, in other places too much. So not getting enough food can look a little bit different depending on what the problem is. So we can talk about undernourishment and malnutrition. These are both two problems with not getting enough food. And so undernourishment is simply based on not receiving enough calories. So if people receive less than 90% of their caloric needs, we term that undernourishment. And so that's just not getting enough energy, right? Whereas malnutrition, on the other hand, is what happens when there are certain key ingredients, certain vitamins and minerals that are not acquired. So you can be getting enough calories, so you're going to eat the fast food every day, get enough calories, but you may still not be getting the essential vitamins and minerals you need. And so eat your fruits and vegetables is a take home on that part. But here in the States, we face a challenge of overnourishment, receiving too many calories. And the reason that's a problem is for public health, right? Because obesity has become a societal problem in the last few decades. So looking from 1991 to 2003, state by state, with the percentage of the population that has a body mass index high enough that would be considered obese, we can see that there were no states in 1991 or 1996 that were more than 20% obese from a population perspective. On the other hand, 2003, the majority of states were there, right? So there's this increase in obesity that's been going on for the last couple of decades. If you look at what it looks like now, we now have several states that are over 35%. And North Carolina has gone on up over 30%. So the trend has only increased. So this is a problem for society when we look at the public cost of obesity. So overnourishment can lead to problems such as heart disease, osteoarthritis, gallbladder disease, type 2 diabetes. All of these risks increase when obesity increases, right? So this is a problem because society has to pay for all of this, right? So looking across the globe, places like the U.S., Western Europe, certain Middle Eastern countries, plenty to eat. But then we look at where the hunger index is most severe. We find that Africa is where it's really most concerning. A couple spots in Asia as well. South America doing pretty well. South America, Central America, with a couple exceptions there. So we can ask what causes global hunger, and the fact is we already grow enough grain to feed everybody on the planet. The problem is access to that food, right? So poverty being concentrated in certain parts of the world leads to certain areas that are not well fed, and inequality again, just not having access to that food. So we're growing enough grain to feed 10 billion people. Problem is that only a little over half of those calories are directly eaten by people. The rest go to livestock or to biofuel, for instance. So it's just a little cartoon. It's estimated that of all the people in the world, about 1 in 10 suffer from chronic hunger. So this is not an isolated problem. This is something that affects us globally to a pretty great extent. So it's estimated that we grow enough food globally to provide everyone 2,000 calories plus 2 medium potatoes left over every day. So yeah, it's a lot of food. And this talks a little bit about waste as well. Just estimated about a third of all food harvested is wasted before it's consumed by a human. So that's pretty dramatic. And if we look back again at the portion of the Earth's land that is used for agricultural purposes, we can look at where food is grown versus where products are grown to be feed for animals and fuel. So we look, for instance, India, right? It's food grown agriculture grown almost exclusively for food. On the other hand, places like Europe, Eastern China, the upper Midwestern United States, the vast majority of products grown there are grown for feed and fuel. So, it just shows you how much of the land that we grow things on is used to produce things besides food. So we can ask what kind of energy, how much energy is needed to support people on the planet. And it's really going to depend on the dietary choices that are made. So we've talked already about the pyramid of numbers and this fact that energy transfer among trophic levels is quite low because this low trophic level transfer efficiency. And not only that, but some animals are a lot better at converting grain into meat. So this cartoon on the right, for instance, it takes about 1.1 kilograms of feed input to produce 1 kilogram of milk. That's a pretty even balance. Chicken, there's almost a 3-to-1 ratio between the amount of feed input and the amount of food that we get out of it. And you can see that ratio keeps going up until you get to beef, where it takes on average 20 kilograms of feed to produce 1 kilogram of beef. So, there are people that are vegetarian because of environmental reasons, reducing the amount of energy required to feed the planet. But even if you still eat meat, it makes a big difference in whether you're eating mostly chicken or mostly beef. 7 times the amount of energy required to produce beef as it does chicken. So thinking of feeding lower on the food web, it's a way to reduce our environmental impact, right? And so when we look from country to country, we see a great disparity in diet, right? So in the U.S., a lot more beef consumed than any other country. Also a lot more poultry. Pork, on par with countries like China and Italy, and mutton similar as well. So you can see that the diet varies to a great extent from country to country. And that, of course, leads to differences in the amount of energy required to support those diets. This has been changing over time as well. As the demographic transition occurs and dietary shifts happen, we can see that from 1960 to 2014, the global meat production increased by almost a factor of 6, right? A factor of 5 or 6. So somewhere on the order of 60 million tons produced in 1960, well up over 300 million in 2014. And that increase has been most striking in Asia. Both India and China, countries up over 1 billion. As we saw earlier, there's a lot of meat that's eaten in Asia, in China. Another factor is the increased use of biofuels. So if you go to the fuel pump, you might see that little sticker that says it may contain up to 10% ethanol. So that ethanol comes from fermented corn. And of course, corn that we're using to make ethanol for fuel is corn that we're not growing to feed people. So from 2002 to 2009, you can see the amount of corn that was grown for ethanol production increased 10 times. Right? So we're growing 10 times as much corn for ethanol production in 2009 as we were in 2002. So again, this is going to drive grain prices up then. Now, against that backdrop, we are seeing global agricultural production trends, and this includes in the so-called least developed countries, this short dashed line. These are countries that have the lowest rates, the lowest quantities of gross domestic product, GDP. But globally, we have been increasing production. Just another way to look at it. Unfortunately, when we look at it per person, the increase is not as great, but it's still evident. So we're growing a lot more food. We're increasing our population, but even when we correct for population, we're still increasing the amount per capita just a bit. All right. So the previous Green Revolution relied on these things that I mentioned, and in addition to this list of 4, we talked about fossil fuels. So the question is, how are we going to increase our agricultural production as our population increases and as countries become more developed economically and start to eat higher up on the food web, right? And so areas that are focused for work include targeted breeding, smarter irrigation, and sustainable farming. So, sort of narrowing down the strains of plants in particular that we're growing to increase production, using water better. We'll talk later in the semester about some water related environmental issues. And then this all comes within this category of sustainable farming, right? The fact that we should be able to grow the food that we need today in a way that won't compromise our ability to grow that food in the future. So I'd like to begin by talking about one of those challenges, and that has to do with genetic diversity. Some of y'all may have done an exercise looking at colors of corn kernels. and that's a trait that's coded for by the corn's genes. So you can look at the colors of the kernels of an ear of corn and say something about its genetic makeup. And so we'll look at how using plants for agriculture has affected their genetic diversity. But first, we might ask the question, why is genetic diversity important? And if we remember that evolution is the mechanism by which species respond to environmental change, and that one of our 3 conditions for evolution to occur is presence of genetic variation, then we'll be reminded that genetic diversity is the raw material for evolution, and without it, organisms can't respond to change in the environment. So it's the raw material for evolution. So just to give you one example, industrial agriculture uses fossil fuels intensively to grow crops. And so it encourages monoculture. Monoculture just means growth of one crop. It encourages that because you have to invest in a lot of technology to be able to grow a particular crop. And so, you're not going to grow 10 different kinds of crops if you have to invest in the machinery 10 different times, right? You're going to grow all of one crop that you have the means to produce, right? So just to show you one example, peas, right? So in 1900, there were over 400 varieties of peas available in seed catalogs. Today, there's only 25 that you can even find, right? So it's been a 95% decrease in the number of varieties. And so that's a drop in genetic diversity there. And of those 25, only a couple work really well with industrial agriculture systems. So, for instance, in 1970, just 2 varieties made up 96% of the U.S. commercial crop. So there's not as much variation out there, which is a problem, because remember, crops are just an ecosystem, right? So when they experience environmental change like other ecosystems, they have to be able to respond. So to give you an example of the consequences of a loss of genetic diversity, we can look at the story of the potato crop. So potatoes were initially domesticated in South America. And so in the Andes, there are up to 3,000 varieties of potatoes that are grown by farmers. And so when you go to the market, there are all these different kinds and colors and shapes of potatoes that vary with the seasons. So potatoes, not native to Ireland, where we might think of them being consumed quite a bit. So how'd they get to Ireland and what happened? Well, during the colonization period, which was marked by an awful lot of brutality as well as resource extraction, the Spanish brought a few varieties of potatoes back to Europe. And they grew really well, so much so that they became the dominant crop in certain countries of Europe, for instance in Ireland. But you might know the story. So in the mid-19th century, there was an outbreak of late blight, which is a fungal disease. So it breaks down the leaves, which makes it so plants can't photosynthesize. It also breaks down the tuber. So a tuber is just a structure underground that plants store energy in. And so a potato it contains starch that plants are using to store energy. Well, so this late blight was a fungus that attacked the tuber, the plant, attacked the whole part of the potato. And so one year it destroyed 40% of the Irish crop. The next year it pretty much wiped it all out. So this is pretty dramatic. Almost a quarter of the population of Ireland either died or left, right? So over 1 million died, twice as many emigrated. This is a painting on the right of a family that's dug up its potato crop, which is supposed to sustain it for the year, and the potatoes are decomposing, and so they realize they won't have the food to survive. And this led to the Irish diaspora, which was when Irish folks moved all over the world from there. Just a little joke, historical reenactors going back to find more potatoes. Anyway. But the blight doesn't only hit potatoes; it hits other things as well. So corn, right, are what we grow a lot of in the upper Midwest, and this fungal blight from time to time can hit our crops pretty hard. So you can see once around 1970, a blight reduced our corn production by about 20%. So this is a problem. These sorts of diseases are problems everywhere, not just in Ireland. But the problem was there wasn't genetic diversity in the crops that were planted in Ireland. So there was no ability to evolve in response, right? And so when we have monoculture without genetic diversity, we're not going to be able to see an evolutionary response to environmental stresses. All right, so the idea then is that these genetic traits can benefit crops in different ways, right? And so now, thanks to biotechnology, we can get traits into species that are not contained in their genes, right? So we can bring a gene in from another species, implant it into the genome of a target species, and change its genome. And then those genes are going to be passed from generation to generation once they get established. And so that's what's known as genetically modifying organisms. But before we go there, the first thing I want to talk about is the difference between genetically modified organisms and selective breeding. So even before biotechnology gave us the ability to genetically modify species, farmers and other folks have selectively bred domesticated species to get them to look or act or taste a certain way. Of course, we have this example with dogs, right? All the dog breeds that have been artificially selected. But we do this in agriculture quite a bit as well. So this is all one species on this slide, Brassica oleracea. The cauliflower, broccoli, kale, Brussels sprouts, all one species. But by selectively breeding over generations, we were able to make the one species look pretty different. Well, genetically modified organisms are fundamentally different. And they're fundamentally different because, as I mentioned, you're not just working with the genetics in the population that you're breeding, you're bringing in genes from a completely different species. So you can take a course in the biology department and learn exactly how this all works, but the long and short of it is you use bacteria to sort of play the role of Trojan horse. So we put a piece of DNA into the genome of the bacteria. That bacteria then infects a host, transfers the DNA, and voila, you have new DNA in the genome. So genetically modified organisms have been engineered using DNA from different species. So there's all kinds of things we can do with genetic modification. We can create cats that are fluorescent. We can do that by taking genes it's often done with marine organisms. So for instance, a gene from a plankton or a jellyfish. And so we can make it so that cats fluoresce under black light. Very scary when it comes time for Halloween. But then we have maybe what we might call more practical agricultural examples. For instance, we have cabbage that has been genetically modified with a gene from a wasp so that it has essentially wasp venom proteins in the cabbage leaves. And why is that advantageous? Well, because there are agriculture pests that would consume that cabbage. So when you have genes from this wasp in there, then these other species don't eat the cabbage. Supposedly, it's safe for human consumption. The very first agricultural GMO that was approved for marketing was what's called the flavor saver tomato. One of the problems with transporting tomatoes and other vegetables during the winter is that they can freeze. And so once they freeze, they're no longer marketable. Their texture changes and they rot pretty rapidly. Well, the flavor saver tomato took advantage of the fact that there are fish species that live in the Arctic. So salt water freezes at a temperature below 0 degrees Celsius. So for fishes to live there, they have to be able to keep their blood from freezing in sub-zero temperatures. And they do this by manufacturing antifreeze proteins that keep their blood from freezing. Well, so these scientists thought, well, hey, if the tomato produces that same protein, then we won't have to worry about the tomato freezing. And so that's what they did. They put the gene from this Arctic fish into a tomato. The tomato produced the protein and it did freeze. Unfortunately, it also tasted really bad. So you can no longer buy Flavor Saver tomatoes. No one wants to buy them. So in next class, we'll talk a little bit more about GMOs, but that's just a little bit of a background on them.